Great. So we are quite close to the end of the retreat. Am I audible clearly? I'm using my laptop speakers, right? Great. Getting close. I know a lot of you have had great insights, great journey through the retreat. Like I mentioned right in the beginning. So the way we go through this retreat is start from a very zoomed out level. Look at what's happening with mind, what's happening in terms of different distractions that are happening, how our mind wanders, start to get familiar with it. Then we zoom in a lot in trying to understand how different moments of experience are constructed. We keep zooming in at the level of moment, at the level of movement from one moment to another, how attention moves, how experiences are constructed, how we give meaning to our interactions with the world. And now we're kind of coming back, right? So how all of this is part of a very comprehensive framework of understanding the world and a framework of changing our own behavior, changing our experience of life. How all of that ties back how the Buddha presented this. So today we'll start that process of tying things together, what we have gone into very deeply, seeing at a granular level. So that's a context. Quick recap of the things that we covered over the last couple of days. So the last 3 days, we looked at the ingredients of human experience. What are the things that come together to form a moment of human experience, which are the 5 aggregates, right, on the skandhas. So starting from roop or form, the material or physical realm, and the mental aspects of it, right? So which start from Vigyan or consciousness, Sangya, Vedana, Sangya or perceptions or concepts, Vedana or feeling, and Sanskar or conditioning, right? So we went into that moment of time, and am I there? I think I froze up for a minute.
No, you are fine.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Yeah. And after that, we went into the process of moving from one moment to another. How does one interaction with the environment lead to a certain chain of thought, which is covering a sequence of moments that are happening? This was the teaching of dependent origination, which looks at not only how different processes are happening, how they're resulting in actions, and how are those actions coloring future actions and future interactions that we have with the environment. So it is an entire sequence that starts from taking things personally, not understanding, starts from ignorance as the base, has conditioning into it, has the different elements of what defines us when we enter a certain movement. Then it has the interaction with the environment, and finally, habitual reactions that we can take that condition our tendency to take things personally further, strengthen our conditioning further. On the other hand, we also know that this is a edifice that is where every link is dependent on the links that come before it. So when we look at craving and we start working with craving, instead of this edifice that is based on ignorance, we can start constructing a different edifice that is based on wisdom. So when we let go of craving, when we don't take things personally in a situation, and we act as per what is most wholesome, most appropriate, most beneficial for ourselves and for other people. So we start building that edifice of wisdom, and that is the way to get out of this compulsive way of working that can affect us quite badly in terms of the outcomes we create for ourselves and for others. Great. So that was the teaching of dependent origination. Yesterday, we got into something that is closely related to dependent origination. So we went through the Chachak Sutra, where the Buddha talks about how each part of our experience, whether it is based on a visual experience, whether it's based on an auditory experience, a mental experience, a tangible experience, an olfactory experience. So whatever experience that we're having, it is predicated on some information, event happening, some information from the external base coming, and contact being established with our internal base and our consciousness. And any feeling, any craving that is coming, the rest of the phenomena that are related to this are all triggered by that one event, event of information. Some visual information coming, hitting our eye and activating our eye consciousness. Some smell coming, hitting our nose, activating our nose consciousness. So the persona that we experience at that moment when we are responding to this stimulus in the environment is very much driven by that particular instance, that particular interaction. We didn't ask for that interaction to come up, and when it came up, it brought up a certain aspect of our personality. And what happens is when we assume this aspect of personality, which is essentially a sense of self that is being brought up to deal with the situation at hand, we can very mistakenly think of this sense of self as permanent, as the situation as permanent, and we can take it personally. When we do these two things, when we take things personally and when we treat ourselves as well as the situation as permanent, we are setting ourselves up for suffering. Because if we find something painful, unpleasant, and we think that it is permanent, we continue to stay in a state of dissatisfaction. If we think something is good and it is not with us, then we stay in a state of dissatisfaction. If we think it is good and it is with us, then as soon as that situation changes, because things are always in flux, as soon as that situation changes, we end up being dissatisfied. So not understanding impermanence and not understanding impersonality leads us to dissatisfaction. So that was the last thing that we covered yesterday in terms of the three characteristics. So today we want to go back to the original presentation that the Buddha gave and the four noble truths and the eightfold path. Okay, so I had mentioned these things earlier in the retreat, but we had not really we did not lay out the four noble truths and eightfold path and then look at each one of these. We've been covering all this territory. We've been covering all the concepts that are part of the eightfold path. And today I just want to bring it together so that we can see how all the different things that we've been discussing through the retreat come together as part of the Buddha's teaching. So just take a pause for a second and I will share my screen and then we'll discuss this further. Right. So there's a very interesting anecdote about the Buddha, right? So it is said, I won't be quoting it very exactly, but the idea was that when the Buddha got had his awakening, right, after searching for I think, almost 6 years, extreme search, very driven search, and finally he had the awakening. So he understood the basis of suffering and the end of suffering, and he realized it in himself. Right? When this happened, he initially had such a deep insight into the nature of reality that he felt that it is impossible to explain this to someone. If I'm going to go out and tell anyone that this is what I've experienced, one, they're not going to understand any of it, and secondly, they're probably going to laugh at it. So this is not going to be useful for anyone. So might as well enjoy the outcome that I've experienced in my life, be rid of suffering, and have a good time. So that was a question that he was pondering. And a celestial being, Brahma, came to him and said, no, this is a very rare occurrence that somebody has discovered this truth, and like the entire universe was conspiring for and supporting for this to happen. So you must definitely share this further. So I'm just paraphrasing. And the Buddha spent some time reflecting whether it was possible, whether it was worth, and finally he decided, yes, there are people with little dust in their eyes. So there are people who are motivated to learn about themselves and to better themselves, and if presented in the right way, this information would actually lead to great outcomes for them. But instead of asking people to go through the same kind of exploration and search for meaning and search for enlightenment that he himself undertook, what he gave instead was a prescription, right? So a much more concise prescription. It may seem very complicated to us, so perhaps we should not even try to fathom what was the complexity of the actual insights that the Buddha himself got, right? So if you recall, I had mentioned the Four Noble Truths earlier in the retreat. And the first noble truth is the truth of suffering, dukkha. The fact that there is dissatisfaction in different points of life. We don't go through life continuously happy or continuously getting happier and happier. There are moments of dissatisfaction. That's a fact. The second noble truth that the Buddha gave was that dissatisfaction is predicated on craving. By now we have understood when we crave something, we get personally attached to it. So when that mechanism of craving, and this is not a high level concept of craving we're talking about, this is the mechanism of craving that we can identify with that tightness and tension. As long as that is there, our attention is latched onto something, and it says, I will be happy only if the world cooperates to give me something that I want, or the world cooperates to take away something I don't want. So we are always predicating our happiness on that, and either the outcome that we want doesn't happen, leading to dissatisfaction, or if it wants, our relation with that outcome changes, or that outcome we become anxious about protecting that outcome from further change. What we discussed about the three characteristics. So the Buddha understood, as long as there is craving, we will always be stuck with that outcome, and as soon as things change, we will be despondent again. So he explained that by the abandonment of craving, we can have the abandonment of suffering. That is the third noble truth, which is the dukkha nirodha. Second one was dukkha samudaya, or origin of suffering and origin of dissatisfaction is craving. And the third one was that with the letting go of craving, we can achieve the letting go of dissatisfaction. And finally, the fourth truth, the Buddha said that this is not just a theoretical exercise, a mental exercise where you do a thought experiment that, okay, if this is predicated on that and that is gone, then this will also. There is an actual way to achieve this in your life, and he described this in the form of the Noble Eightfold Path. So he said, there is a path, and I give you this path. If you walk this path, you will achieve this extinguishment of craving, and therefore the extinguishment of suffering in your own life. So that is the Noble Eightfold Path, also known as the Arya Ashtangik Marg. Okay, and here are the elements. On the screen, you see the elements of the Eightfold Path. There are 8 different elements, which is why it's called the Eightfold Path. And these are broadly divided into 3 sections, right? Understanding, mental skills, and behavior. We've talked about mental skills right in the beginning. From the prep kit, we've been talking about the mental skills. I have repeated it multiple times since the first few days of the retreat. The mental skills being mindfulness, right effort or harmonious practice, and collectedness. right? And what understanding and behavior mean? We have been either doing some of these or learning about these continuously. So I'll bring them and you'll be able to see for us. So the first of the Noble Eightfold Path is Samma Ditti. Ditti is the Pali equivalent of Drishti. Right? And in this usage, we can think of it as a view, right? And view or a perspective, right? So that is one way to understand the idea, the word Drishti. And this is called wise understanding, right? Understanding what? Understanding the impermanent nature of things, understanding suffering, understanding the impersonal nature of things, the three characteristics, being able to see that. Right? Understanding dependent origination, understanding how different links, when there is a sequence of things happening in our lives, and at a certain point, when craving comes into the picture, from that point on, we get compulsively and personally involved with the situation. Right? So understanding dependent origination, not just understanding dependent origination, also understanding how that dependence works, how one link is dependent on the links below, and by eliminating a link below, you can affect the links that are above. And finally, the Four Noble Truths, the understanding of suffering and its basis on craving. So this is wise understanding, seeing this for yourself, right? So not just intellectually understanding this, but actually starting to intellectually understand it, starting to see it in your practice and consolidating that as an internalization. So that is wise understanding. The next is Samma Sankalpo or Sankalp. So this is often translated as right thought or intention, but I like to go closer to the actual word of Sankalp that is used in Sanskrit, right? And I have checked this with the way the Sankalpo is used in the different suttas. And what's a good way to think about it is wise resolve and vision. So Sankalp, when we look at the Sanskrit word, means both a vision of how we would want things to be, how we would want our life to be, and the resolve to get it, right? So once you have the wise understanding, once you have the understanding of dependent origination, the characteristics, there is a determination to bring that understanding as an active part of your life. You want to develop your mind so that this can be visible to you at all points of time, and that you can work actively to reduce suffering for yourself and others. Not only this, there is also vision of yourself. So vision of ourselves. So whenever we think in terms of craving makes us small at any point of time. So if you think of, so a little while back, I was at an airport and there was a Hamleys, a toy store over there. And right outside that, I literally saw this, right? So there was a child that was beating its fists on the floor, asking for a toy, and his father was literally grabbing one arm. So he was beating the floor with one arm and he was dragging the child on the floor with the other arm. Right? So it was that child had entered a mega tantrum. So that's how we become. When our mind gets overtaken by craving, we are like that child with a tantrum. I want this, right? I don't want this. I don't like this. Why did this person say this to me? Why did this person say this to me? Why did this vehicle cross the road, right? Or I want this job. I want this job. I want this race. I want this race, right? Something like that. So when we get into craving, we become tiny because we have given away the keys of our happiness to the vagaries of circumstance, right? So if the entire world cooperates to give me what I want and to preserve it in that permanent state, preserve that exactly as I want it, then I'll be happy. Otherwise, I will be in that tantrum. So understanding this, we also aspire for an expansive and generous attitude. So where we have, in any situation, we have the confidence and the ability to make a positive change. And it's a very simple way, right? So if you have the ability to smile simply, or use the Brahma Viharas, then no matter what the situation, you always have the ability to make a positive change in the situation. In fact, in one sutta, the Buddha says that even if you're caught up by bandits and they're severing your limbs, right? So at that time, you still have the agency to wish them well in their life. I mean, if you don't wish them well in your life, you're only making yourself smaller. Of course, you don't put yourself in that position, you try to escape, but in case you are caught there without any option, you still have the ability to make a positive change in that situation. You give them a smile, right? So a vision towards that kind of a expansive, generous attitude. That is Samma Sankalpa. Then we have the 3 skills that we have been practicing continuously in our meditation. We've discussed a lot about this, which are the 6 R's: mindfulness, remembering to observe attention and its movement, and collectedness, which can be called jhanas, or the ability to stay with whatever object or anything, activity that we intend to do. And finally, the section on behavior. So this is something that we want to talk about. So eventually, like I said, towards the end of the retreat, we are not only tying things together, but we are also talk about how to use this to actually make changes to our daily life, right? So, and this is something we'll unpack in more detail tomorrow. But I want to give a brief of what the Buddha talked about. So the first is Samma Vacha, or harmonious communication. And this is about everything to do with language. So language is not just what we speak out aloud. Language is also the way we think, the way we talk to ourselves, right? It is also the way we think about things, the concepts that we have. So for example, if we have a concept of justice, if we have a concept of fairness, there are words that we use to think about it, right? So harmonious communication includes everything that we think in the, with the linguistic tools, right? So Samma Vacha is harmonious communication. The word Samma in Pali is rooted in the Sanskrit Samyak, which means appropriate or what is suitable, right? So harmonious communication. So whenever we are already taking the precepts, so we take the precept to abstain from lies, from harsh speech, from slander, from gossip, right? So gossip means creating some kind of friction between 2 groups of people. Slander is actually talking badly about somebody behind their back. But these are examples. Right? So harmonious communication involves not going into these ways of not only speaking but also thinking. So we also talked about the example that there was a question about habitual tendencies, and say what happens if we don't actually say it out aloud, but we just get to the point where we are thinking. It is still affecting. It is a mental action. It is still affecting the way you are conditioned, the way you are structured. It is affecting the way you're going to experience your next moment and your tomorrows. Okay? So harmonious communication, think and communicate with the base of the Brahma Viharas. Instead of craving, instead of I want this, I don't want that. Instead of that, you think about what can I do that is beneficial to me and to other people. So that becomes a base of the Brahma Viharas. Similarly, Samma Kammantu, harmonious actions. So we already, for example, in the precepts, we talk about a few types of actions that we want to abstain from. So what are those kind of actions? Sexual misconduct, we not taking something that is not freely given to us, harming or killing another living being. So these are actions that we are guarding against, but these are only some extreme forms of action, right? We can perform a lot of small actions that create some kind of unwholesome outcomes. Again, when this is likely to happen when you have craving as the support for your state of mind. With the state of the Brahma Viharas as the base of our thinking and our action, we always end up doing harmonious actions. And finally, the last part, which is interesting. So this is called Samma Ajiva, or harmonious lifestyle. Now, not much is written about this. This very basic guidelines given that don't traffic in slaves and butcher animals. So some examples are given because the Buddha taught that directly harming animals is not is going to lead to bad outcomes for you because of the state of mind that it creates in you, the way it conditions you. So instead, when we think about harmonious lifestyle, let's not just think about a particular occupation, but something also influenced by the fact that the Buddha mostly, teachings of the Buddha that are preserved today are mostly teachings given to monastic segments. Right? So if you think about today, we have very, very complicated lifestyles, very different, new kind of professions. So for example, very simple thing. So if you think about not supporting something unwholesome, the moment you are part of the economic system, somewhere or the other, your money, there is some indirect trail of how your money is, used to fuel something that is bad for the environment or some terrorist activity. You'll find that trail, right? So we live in a very complex kind of world, and in the suttas, unfortunately, not too much direct instruction is given. You have to understand the rest of the Eightfold Path to actually try to figure out what it means for a lifestyle. And I like to think of lifestyle as multiple things, right? So it is everything that's in your environment. Right? So what does your environment contain? Does your environment contain things that lead you down the path of craving? So for example, if you have an alcoholic problem and you continue to have alcohol around you, is that a conducive environment for you? Or if you work in a company where maybe you are directly instructed by your manager or superiors to lie to customers. So at all points of time, you are continuously creating, you're fracturing reality in your mind. You're really creating unwholesome experiences for yourself and for others, right? So harmonious lifestyle is about the environment, immediate and physical environment. It is about the people that are around you. It is about the place that you work. So are these conducive? Are they helping you get to your vision? That vision of having a expansive and generous mind that is able to take wholesome actions. So this is something we need to see and move towards. And for all of these, we will have a starting point, and over time we develop each of these folds of the Eightfold Path, and we take them more and more towards better outcomes. That's what we wanted. One thing I wanted to call out about the precepts, right? So when do we break the precepts? Precepts are a great example of, so precepts are a great signal for taking things very personally. So the only reason that we tell something like a lie, because a lie is painful to us. We're creating parallel versions of the truth. Or we slander someone, or we speak harshly, is because we are caught up that I will do anything to gain something, or I will do anything because I dislike something. So like and dislike leads us to break the precepts. If we didn't have a strong like or dislike for something, we were unlikely to lie or slander. If we are not completely swept up in the like or dislike of something, we are unlikely to harm someone or physically, or to take something that doesn't belong to us. So precepts, keeping the precepts is useful because they condition our mind to stay away from things that undo all the good work that we are doing in developing our mind, right? So the more personally we take things and we do unwholesome actions, not only do we create suffering as a result of those actions, but we also affect our conditioning in a way that we basically say that if I can give a justification, right, then I can do anything. So I had mentioned this earlier in the retreat. The Buddha talks about, he says that a monk who is willing to tell a deliberate lie, not ashamed of it, then there is nothing that the monk can do. Because once the mind has found that loop, right, that if I can create an explanation, then I can justify what I've done. Then there is nothing that the mind will be unable to justify. So this is the Noble Eightfold Path. The three sections can be called the Pragya Skand, the Samadhi Skand, and the Shil Skand, which is related to behavior. The last. So this is the Noble Eightfold Path, and where does this take us? So I just want to talk a little bit about what is, like, where can this practice really take us, right? And what can be like outsized outcomes that come from. Also, before that, quick, some of you are in this state called the quiet mind. So even if you're not in the quiet mind, eventually what we want is we want to achieve a state where our mind is both calm and alert, right? So that is the best state for understanding and developing the mind. When it is calm, so that we can actually get insights, we can actually see what's happening, and alert, so that we can actually see what's happening in great detail. So we want this to happen. If you struggle with this in your practice or at any point in your daily life, so what are some things that you can use? So just wanted to comment on this. These are called the awakening factors, and we'll shortly get to why they are called the awakening factors, right? We talked about the two types of hindrances, one pair of twins called restlessness and sloth. So these come up when either the mind is desperately seeking stimulation or it is overstimulated and fatigued. So what are things that we can use at that point of time? A couple of you asked me in the interviews as well, so I just wanted to call this out. Okay, so there are these 7 factors that we use to deal with restlessness and sloth. In the center, we have mindfulness. So unless we have awareness of what's happening with our attention, we'll never understand if there is restlessness or sloth, right? Mindfulness helps us to be alert to the existence of restlessness or sloth in our mind. When we get restless, what are the tools that we can use? So the first tool is equanimity. So when our mind gets restless, it takes a little while to come back to the object of meditation. You want to go away from your practice, or in daily life, you are continuously waiting for something to happen. You know, you're impatient, you're stuck in traffic, you're waiting for something, you're impatient. So the first thing that you can use to combat this is equanimity. Equanimity is understanding that things arise because conditions are right. So not to get too swept up in the like or dislike. Something came up in your mind, it came up because conditions were right for it. If restlessness came up, it also came up because conditions were right for it. No need to judge yourself, no need to get annoyed about it, no need to get chasing after it, no need to fight it or overpower it. So equanimity just says, okay, things are happening because conditions are right for it. I don't need to get too excited. Once we remind ourselves about that, we stop trying to do something with that restlessness or force it to be in a certain way. We stop trying to force the mind to be a certain way. We just allow it. That is the first factor to use when restlessness arises. The second is tranquility. Tranquility or prashrabdi is related to the relaxed step that we use. Right? So always tranquility we can achieve by identifying and relaxing the tightness that we have in our mind. So anytime your mind is getting restless, either in some activity or in daily life or in meditation, right? Just there will be a baseline tightness that that is fueling that restlessness. If you can identify, use the 6 hours or just simply relax that. That will help you with the restlessness also. The third thing is collectedness. Right? So collectedness here simply means remembering to stay with the object, giving it importance. Right? So what happens is that sometime in our meditation, sometimes in our whatever activity that we're doing, we are more caught up with why are we not able to do it, or like what's happening around it, rather than we forget to put our attention to the object itself. We assume that that activity is happening in an automated way, right? Collectedness is simply remembering and giving due importance to the activity that we intended to do, right? So if it was to keep our mind with the object of meditation, then so be it, right? Give importance to that. Stay with it. Stay with the object, right? Give priority to staying with the object. And similarly, if you're working on something, give priority to staying with that. So just doing that and being with that, right? Rather than wanting your mind to be in a certain way, just deciding to stay with the object. That is collectedness or samadhi. Right? So being with it in a very gentle way, not grasping at it, not saying I want this more than anything else. Just simply that at this point of time, I have decided to be with this gently, effortlessly, without craving and grasping. We stay with the object. That is the state of samadhi. So that is the third thing we can bring up when restlessness arises. What happens when sloth arises? Sloth is typically arising because we have expended all our mental energy chasing restlessly after certain information. So when sloth arises, there are three tools that we can use, three factors. First is joy. Easiest way is to bring up joy is to smile, or you can laugh at whatever is happening in your mind. Laugh at, so for example, your mind, you don't want to do something, right? And your mind will come up with very funny, very ridiculous excuses, right? Why can't I do it tomorrow? It's a foolish excuse because tomorrow you can make the same excuse. There is no reason you won't make the same excuse tomorrow. Right? So when the mind makes silly excuses for sloth, for laziness, being able to smile at it, being able to laugh at it, right? Using the smile itself, by itself, just the physical act of smiling, physical act of laughing also brings energy and, mind of interest into your mind, right? So joy is the first factor. You can also think of it as a video game, right? So there is no losing. Everything that happens is fun. We are having fun. We are not trying to do a task, or we are not trying to achieve anything. We're just trying to have fun with the meditation or with anything, any activity. This is the activity that I've been asked to do right now. We have fun with it. So why should I make it a chore? Why should I make it a project? Second factor that you can use is energy. So this is using the basis of sankalp, right? So the fact that we have a certain vision that we want to work towards, have some determination towards it, use that to generate energy. Take interest in the practice, take interest in the object, resolve to catch the mind a little earlier before it drifts away, right? So be determined to sit for a certain time that you have targeted for the day. And finally, curiosity or investigation factors. Also, it's called Dhamma Vijay. This is simply the hunger for learning, right? This is a profound lesson that you're teaching yourself every time you observe your mind. What is happening with mind? How am I creating experiences? How am I experiencing the world? How am I creating happiness or dissatisfaction for myself by the way I deal with craving? Right? So all these things are available for you to examine and understand in your own mind. Like I said, we've discussed the map of the territory. Now you have the skills, you have the understanding to start walking that territory and understand what's happening over there. So having that curiosity, that intent to learn about the mind, in my humble opinion, it is probably the most profound thing you can ever learn. So that's what these are the awakening factors. These can be the factors of joy, curiosity, energy, can be used to counter sloth, and the factors of equanimity, tranquility, and collectedness can be used to counter restlessness. And when we do this, we start, so this seesaw goes up and down, restlessness and sloth. And when we are able to keep all these factors at the right level, so we get a calm and alert. And this is where the learning becomes maximized. The mind is completely calm, the mind is completely alert. And whatever happens in the mind, we are able to see it in great detail. Right? This, like I mentioned, these factors you can use in daily life, you can use during daily activities, and you can also use during your practice when you find that your mind is getting lazy or restless. Okay. Now, what happens when we develop the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, along with the understanding of the awakening? So we talked about, instead of always being in that, mind filled with craving, what is in it for me? What do I like? What do I dislike? We can use a different kind of mechanism that lies within us, that of generosity, that of giving, where you're not continuously asking what is in it for me. And this is the Brahma Viharas. We also talked about how we can cultivate these Brahma Viharas, right? So how from a little seed, we can start developing it through practice, through forgiveness meditation, through loving kindness meditation, through acts of generosity. We can start cultivating this till it sprouts. And this takes us through the first four. I didn't get into much detail about the different jhanas. So I'll just continue not to get into many details. I will share a handout in the next few days. That will be useful. But these are different states. It's not very important at this stage to understand each state very deeply. But these are different states that your mind goes through as your mind gets deeper. And what happens is in these states, the mind stays effortlessly with the object of meditation, and it also starts having a lot of ability to see the other phenomena that are happening. So we've talked about being able to read a book in a well-lit room, right? So the jhanas are like that well-lit room where different activities of your mind are like the text in the book, and you're able to see it in great detail and cement that understanding that you have in your mind. So metta takes us from the first to the fourth jhana. These are progressively deeper and more stable and more subtle levels of the jhanas, right? Your mind goes deeper, the amount of activity is less, the duration for which your mind can stay with the object becomes higher, and then it goes further deeper and further deeper. What's happening is different mechanisms that are constantly, desperately trying to figure out survival in the environment, they are starting to get a little calm down. They know that you're in a safe space. They know that you're not, there is no imminent threat at this moment. They know that you are not chasing after things that might be threats or opportunities, that you are continuing to come back to the object of meditation, which is a wholesome object. So these mechanisms start coming, like that we don't really need to be completely active at this point of time. However, we continue to be both calm and alert. So this is a difference from going to sleep. So our alertness goes away when we go to sleep, and therefore, we, even though our mind is calm, fewer things may be happening, we will have no insight. Here, our alertness is very high. So as we go from the fourth jhana, what happens is at this point, we start going into the arupa jhanas. Arupa jhanas, like I mentioned, because there is no movement happening, the mind stops worrying about the body, and you get a feeling of being disembodied. And you feel like the physical barrier between you and the rest of the world has disappeared. Right? So the physical barrier is a construct of your mind. Right? So your mind gives you a sense of being encapsulated within this body, because this is where all the, the touch is, the touch sensors are. It says this is till where my sensors are, right? So once the mind stops bothering about the body, we go into the arupa jhanas. You're now completely focused on mental activities. So it's not as if somebody came and touched you, you would immediately register that. Something fell near you, you would register that. But it's not the same as being continuously, seeking for that kind of information. So we go into the arupa jhanas, and here the first jhana is the base of infinite space, where that sense of embodiment kind of disappears. The feeling goes from metta to karana. The next is the base of infinite consciousness, and the feeling goes from karuna to mudita. What starts happening here is we start feeling the absolute beginning of different contacts. So at this point, for example, there is some ambient sound coming to my ears, some light coming to my eyes. There's a feeling of sitting on the chair, having my feet on the floor. So a lot of contacts are happening continuously. And in the sixth jhana, with every contact, like we discussed, that's external sense base, internal sense base, and a consciousness that arises when these come together. Right? So with every contact, there is a consciousness, there's an information processing that is happening. And we start becoming aware of all these little things in the base of infinite consciousness. We start getting aware of individual consciousness. So every time you hear my voice, for example, there's a lot of different sound waves hitting your ear. It is not one word that you're actually hearing. That is how you're reconstructing it in your mind. But the actual sound is coming to you in multiple waves, right? And we start hearing things at that, and hearing or sensing things at that granularity. So we are going earlier and earlier in the links of dependent origination, where earlier when we start our practice, we are able to think only when we are in the midst of a story. Now we are going towards where the contact is actually happening, right? Even before craving. Finally, from here, the mudita, or the rejoicing, the altruistic joy, appreciative joy, taking joy in not just our happiness, but anybody else's success, anybody else's good fortune. From there, the feeling changes into upekha or equanimity, the highest of the Brahma Viharas. And this takes us to the seventh jhana, the base of nothingness. In the base of nothingness, things stop happening. You stop associating things with different actions that are happening. You start seeing the very, very beginning of mental phenomena that are happening. Absolute beginning. So the way our attention goes from one thing to another, first something else happens, something else comes in, and it starts to vie for our attention. It starts to create some kind of disturbance in our field of attention. That's the very beginning of craving. And from there, we start to go towards that object. So in the quiet mind, what happens? There is nothing that our mind is chasing after. And after some time, even the equanimity or the feeling that is coming out, that dries out. We simply stay with the quiet mind. We simply stay with our field of awareness and start seeing the very beginning of different mental processes and calm them then. We're getting very deep insights into the absolute beginning of the mental process. From this comes a very interesting state called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. I'm just giving an overview of these states. And here what happens is, it's a very interesting state where you may feel that you're both asleep and awake. And what happens there is, certain perceptions are happening. Certain things are happening in your awareness. Mind is understanding that, but before it gives a name, before it even says that there is a little wobble here, there's a little squeeze happening there. Before it gets even there, the mind just stops. That mental activity doesn't go ahead, right? So you are perceiving something, but you're not really getting to the point where it becomes a full perception. This is called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. What's happening here is, even the act of observing that you're doing, right? That is the result of a mental consciousness that is coming. That is the result of mental processing that is happening. So because all the processes are becoming calmer and calmer and calmer, even this process doesn't get very agitated. It just starts and it kind of stops. So there is not too much perception happening. You're just staying in a zone where you're neither perceiving nor not perceiving. It's a very interesting state. And what happens in this state now, anything that you see, right? It is like you have completely zoomed in and you're using a very, very, very high res camera and you're able to see things in extreme slow motion, right? Anything that's happening in your mind right now, it's just coming in very slowly, right? And you're learning a lot about the activity of mind. And what might happen is, at some point, there may be a gap in this. There may be a gap where nothing is happening, and even the act of observing, even that there is a pause in that act of observing. This kind of a gap can happen, and the mind can stay in this little gap for a little while. And what might happen is, right after that, the next set of processes that happens, the mind sees that very clearly. There is absolutely nothing, right? There's not even like 5 or 10 different mental processes happening. You come down to zero. This is called a cessation, experience of cessation. And right after that, the next set of links of dependent origination that fire off, like mental mechanism, sequence of mental mechanisms that fire up. Your mind sees that it can happen. Right? So after not, there may be some kind of winks in consciousness, gaps in consciousness, where you don't end up seeing this. But if your mind is perfectly calm and perfectly alert, right, using the awakening factors, you might have this cessation, and as you come out of it, you will see the next set of mental mechanisms happening, right? From a contact, ignorance and conditioning being the base, and a contact happening, craving happening, and a habitual action happening. You'll be able to see all of that. So it becomes like seeing a magician's trick, right? So once you've seen that magician's trick, till then it is a mystery trick. But once you've seen that trick for yourself, right? Then you have a understanding of that trick. That trick never remains the same, right? You have an very deep experiential understanding. So after cessation, once if the mind is calm and alert and one is able to see the links of dependent origination, happens the event known as awakening, right? So the first set of awakening. So awakening is also a graded process. This kind of an event can lead to the first event where there is a complete transformation. So a lot of people associate all the, you would want to know what is the culmination of following the path, of following the practice, right? So this is one of the important stages that you can reach with this practice. And when this happens, you basically have a very different understanding of how your mind works, how your experience works, how life happens. And because of that experience, you start making, automatically there start to be a lot of changes in behavior. Your ability to understand how mind is behaving in a particular situation improves. Your ability to influence your behavior in those situations also improves. So this is what is known as a awakening event, the first, and there can progressively be more and more awakening events that can lead you to a higher and higher level of understanding, as well as higher and higher level of changes in your behavior. So once the first event happens, you have no doubt about the things that we have discussed, right? So about the reality of it, you have no doubt about it, that this is how the mind works and this is how suffering happens and this is how suffering can be overcome. And other things happen. There's a great amount of reduction in hatred, in aversion, in greed and lust, so those kind of tendencies of yours get greatly calmed down as well, right? And you stop believing in things that are faith-based. You want to see evidence. You want to see it in your own experience. You want to see it in a process, and you believe that is what will take you to a good understanding. And you also understand very clearly. You see for yourself that the self, for example, when the links of dependent origination fired, you see that the self emerged as a outcome of that process. So the sense of self that we experience is the outcome of a mental process. It is not a permanent self that is a separate entity. Right? So these are some of the kind of insights, some of the kind of changes that happen when you experience cessation by going deeper and deeper into this practice, going through the jhanas, and finally being able to master the awakening factors so that you can fall into the cessation and emerge with a calm and alert mind. Great. So yeah, that was the summary of the path the Buddha gave and where it can take you. Any thoughts, any questions?
Thanks a lot, Rajiv.
Are you saying something, Rohitji?
I just said thanks a lot. It's wonderful.
Yes, very true. All the discourses are so nicely, easily understandable. Beautiful.
Rati, tell me one thing.
Yes.
When we talk about the awakening factors, right? We had mindfulness, then we have equanimity, we have tranquility and collectedness, right? So in the entire process, if first being mindfulness is something, which basically tells us where our attention is moving from our object of meditation to somewhere else. So the end result that we're looking at, right, is collectedness, correct?
Collectedness is one of the things that we want, right? So the awakening factors is essentially saying that there are a bunch of things, when they're in balance, our mind is calmest and most alert at that point of time, right? So if you have a certain amount of joy, certain amount of energy, certain amount of tranquility, certain amount of collectedness, certain amount of curiosity, certain amount of, so we are essentially in the best position to observe and learn at that point of time. So we are trying to get to that perfect balance where your mind is, so we need both, right? So if your mind is not calm, then there are too many things happening. Then you can't really get really deep insights. And if your mind is not alert, then even if fewer things are happening, you don't really understand the depth of it.
Okay.
Great. Any other thoughts or questions? Otherwise, we'll end the session.
Rajiv, it's easy to relate these concepts with when one is in a mode of suffering, or see things that are not going their way.
Hmm.
How to apply these when we are in a state of joy itself, or we see everything is happening is very well, I'm growing, I'm on a very good path, on a good trajectory. How does one keep themselves humble and come back to these concepts and not get overwhelmed by them?
Yeah, that's a great thing. So the point is, so if you think about it, right? So what happens is typically, like you mentioned, right? So people look for solutions only when they're suffering, right? So even if something is required, right? So people will, you see all the old people walking in the park. So they've been told by their doctor that you're going to die unless you start walking today, right? So unfortunately, as humans, we want to take the laziest way out, easiest way out all point of time. If instant gratification we're getting, we don't need to do something, right? So people go for a walk in the park when their doctor says your heart is going to fail in 6 months if you don't start walking now, right? So that unfortunately, a lot of us come to action only when we get a cake, right? So, but if we have, it is possible, so everybody experiences dissatisfaction at some point of time, right? You may have certain growth, but what's happening is you are always using that certain outcomes with the external world. I had this growth, I had this thing, I had this acquisition, I became known as success, as a success by people. You understand that those are not things that continuously give you happiness, right? You will have moments of dissatisfaction, and then when you try to evaluate, you will rationalize that I'm happy because I have these things, even if these things are not good, right? And that's what we are learned to do, that you rationalize and you somehow make peace with what things are happening. That is the something I mentioned right in the beginning, right? Being fine, right? So being 4 out of 7 at any point of time is acceptable. 4 or 7 out of 10 is acceptable, right? When you want 10 out of 10, when you want to understand why there were points of dissatisfaction, right? Why, in spite of all of this, why should there be even a single moment of dissatisfaction? When you start to ask those questions is when you start to make those changes in your life, right? Yeah, that's pretty much all I can say, right? So if things are going well for you, remember that if you are attached to something, then even if you get it, then you start wanting it to feel that way forever, wanting it to stay that way forever, being afraid of it being taken away from you, right? And we have to maintain it. So I think one great example is like every movie, almost like 99% of the movies end when there is a romantic union of the protagonists, and every fairy tale ends there and says happily ever after. But you should check with people who've been married whether it is always like constant happily ever after, right? So it's about being able to understand that, not just being rationalizing what's happening, understanding that, hey, there are moments of dissatisfaction. Why should they happen in my life? Is there something I can do to overcome that? Being able to see the state of mind, the state of satisfaction or dissatisfaction as a kind of ultimate North Star. Right? So that's what happens. At some point of time, you're like, what is the ultimate North Star is this, right? So I don't need to rely on the external world for happiness. I need to be able to improve my mental skills, my mental understanding, so I can have that happiness internally. And I can actually be an asset to the world. I can, instead of thinking about productivity, instead of thinking about return on my investment, I can think about how can I be of service to the world, right? So just changing that North Star, it's not a easy it's not a very obvious process. For most people, it comes when at least for the first time they've acknowledged that something off, right? Like I was mentioning. So if we are a very intelligent and learning creature, and if we know that happiness is important, then our happiness graph should be like this, right? So if it is not like that, then there is something missing, and somewhere either through a event of suffering or through a lucky event where somebody says something to you, your eyes start getting open in that direction. You start asking certain questions, right? And you find that none of your education really prepares you for that answer.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a bit of fortune, it's a bit of strife that kind of brings you towards the path.
Okay.
Are you going to share the charts which you had prepared on the group?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Let's share merit and we'll end the session today. May suffering once be suffering free, and the fear struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May enlightened beings of mighty power share in this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu. Thank you, everyone.